This is a project with this title, and I want to go on to the next slide here. And I have to give credit to the funding body. It was part of a big project of the European Research Council, funded by the European Research Council. And the project was under the leadership of Chris Hahn at Max Planck Institute. And from this project, I'm working on a book. So the paper I'm presenting today is hopefully either part of this book or a publication separate from that. I will be reading primarily to keep time. So to start with, my first trip to Sparta was in the summer of 2015, and I was excited about finally experiencing the smells and beauty of the plant I had been reading so much about, the oil-bearing fragrant rose, Rosa Damascena, known as Sparta rose in Turkey. However, in summer, when approaching the city from the airport, the rose fields to the side of the road were hardly noticeable. They were simply green bushes, barely distinguishable from rows of other plants and fruits grown in the province. And the green bushes produced no smells. Rose blossoms only filled the air with their faint scent during the months of May and early June. However, when arriving to the city from the west and passing through the large avenues named after the former president and famous politician from the province, Süleyman Demirel, one could at any time admire the well-kept flower beds in the middle of the road, with many rose bushes in full bloom. Like many first-comers to the city, I assumed that these were the famous Rosa Damascena, the fragrant rose, but was corrected by the taxi driver. They were simply ordinary roses of various kinds that have no smell. The main avenues to the city, as well as the university campus, which you see on the left picture, also named after Demirel, exhibit many ornaments and decorations with the rose. Some are kitsch, but the prominence of rose imagery is very visible, as you see on the bus here. Furthermore, the city center has many shops displaying a range of products made by local firms, from souvenirs and ornaments to food and cosmetics. Rose locum, rose jam, eau de cologne with rose water tonic, face and hand creams, and soap. These are the most popular products sold and bought in Sparta, a city with thousands of university students, bureaucrats, and recruited soldiers strolling through the main shopping area. Given that Rosa Damascena is such a significant plant and a source of local goods, what I want to explore in this paper is how the smell and image of the rose are transformed into a marketable product. The image of the rose is clearly everywhere, but not necessarily related to the specific fragrant rose. The link between the smell and the image is fictive. In fact, one could argue that the image tries to overcome the temporal presence of the smell. The smell exists only during a few months, when it needs to be captured and transformed into a product. Hence, it involves a temporal challenge. But the rose's image seems to be essential for appreciating the smell as well. Hence, the question I raise here is how this disjunction between the smell and the image is overcome. I approach this question from two perspectives. One is by paying attention to the agricultural cycle, the agricultural economy of the rose, and the political economy of the rose oil production. So far, this has been my main effort, and I have written on the political economy of the rose and rose oil production. Here you could see the source. Here I have examined the various actors in rose cultivation and rose oil production, as well as the forces of the market, illustrating how the prices of rose and rose oil products are formed within the interrelated production processes and global trade chains. The knowledge about these different scales of agriculture, commodity production, marketing, and price formation was restricted and not transparent. which meant that rose producers, as well as rose oil processors, work without clear knowledge about the price of their labor and their immediate earnings. Nevertheless, the price of the rose oil in particular boomed and crashed cyclically over the years, and the difference between the gains of rose producers and those of rose oil processors was mystified and evaporated like the fragrance of unprocessed rose oil. This story, however, did not explore the volatile quality of the fragrance at any further length and did not draw on the anthropology of smell in order to expand on how smelling works and how odors need to be translated through other senses and appropriate mechanisms and are dependent on various facilitators for identification and commodification. Insights from the anthropology of smell look promising for deepening the analysis of the transformation from rose to rose oil and perfume, which I was addressing earlier. This complementary perspective, I argue, would unpack and help to analyze the mystification of the smell and its price through paying attention to how smells work and how the history of smells and smelling has shaped and continues to shape our cognition. Here I propose to explore some of the findings from the anthropology of smell, and at the end we'll come back to a possible conjunction of the economic and the smelly aspects of Rosa Damascena. What kinds of insights does the anthropology of smell offer? One insight is its being embedded in the anthropology of the body. The other is the knowledge we have about the cognitive history of smells and human cultures and the way smells have been perceived in different historical cultural periods. To begin with, smelling has been discussed as part of the bodily functions and as one of the senses. Within this context, smelling is related to physical, chemical, as well as behavioral psychological phenomena. Anthropologists have relied first and foremost on biological and behavioral explanations, so I shall first look at some of these latter phenomena. So, smell is a chemical reaction. The sense of smell has been explained by neuroscientists as having to do with a chemical reaction where chemoreceptive sense of cells pick up and transmit chemical information in the outside world just as surely as does every cell within the body. This is from Michael Stoddard, and smelling is also connected most directly to the brain, even shortcutting some neurological processes. This is different than seeing and hearing, for instance. Michael Stoddard explains the sense of smells in the following way. Odors seem to penetrate the deepest levels of unconscious mind because it is so direct, he says. Now, human odors communicate, as we know, especially bad odors, illness, but more pleasant odors, sexual attraction, and have been changing along the evolutionary continuum. Natural scientists like Stoddard have been interested in the evolutionary aspects of this sense and in explaining why natural odors related to sexual reproduction have come to be considered indelicate in human cultures. Stoddard sees this as the continued persistence of the ancient structures and pathways which firmly link the human sense of smell to sexual reproduction. This persistence has substantial and significant consequences for human culture and human social evolution. This is the quotation from him. According to Stoddard, other senses like seeing and hearing have come to be seen as being more civilized and part of human social culture. And I quote, "The supremacy of the eyes and ears over the nose readily leads one to the belief that humans are olfactorily second-rate," end of quote. But Stoddard concludes that perhaps they are in relation to the perceptive powers of the dog, but in considering the human body as a producer of odorous substances, man is almost the most richly endowed primate, end of quote. The link between smell and other senses and to evolutionary and cultural historical development is important and is a point I will come back to later in this paper. What I want to highlight from this discussion involves 3 points. That there is a hierarchical relationship between the senses, but nevertheless, smells are direct in causing physical, biochemical, and psychological reactions. And thirdly, that human bodily odors have been suppressed and sublimated into more civilized types of odors. Now, let's move on to smell in cultural history. Another powerful discussion on the senses comes from cultural history and historical anthropology. Cultural historians of the senses tell us that since Aristotle and later the Enlightenment, but especially since the 18th and 19th centuries in the West, vision has gained prominence, especially through association with the rise of science, while other senses have become secondary, if not discredited. But Constance Classen, from whom I'm citing here, she warns us that this bias should not be shared or accepted by anthropologists, and that the anthropology of the senses focuses on all senses and examines how meaning is attached to each one of them. She hence underlines the cultural aspect of sensory experiences and their non-reducibility to some chemical or physical aspect. The development of internal hierarchies between various senses, however, seems to be unstoppable. Visuality, as we all know, has gained even more dominance in the new IT era. And I would say with the recent pandemic, one might say that even our sense of touching other humans is being curtailed, harnessed, and potentially dismissed. Now, what is the discussion of smells in anthropology? The third part of investigations into smells and smelling as a sense comes from the social and cultural anthropology, attention to smell being paid mostly in the context of rituals, religion, and magic in the more classical era. The early ethnographies documented, for instance, the use of incense in magic, rituals, and exchange. Similarly, and perhaps at a later historical period of anthropological studies, we find attention given to smell as a sense in the anthropology of the body. Smell is an important feature of food and cooking in the anthropology of food. Smell is a subject of research, especially very interestingly in memory studies, and more recently in the anthropology of business. Here I have in mind an author who writes about the marketing of perfume. The anthropology of smells follows partly this discussion of smell in cultural history, and its significance and cognition have been discussed by other social and neurological scientists. More generally, therefore, smells have been part of ethnographic descriptions of places and people, of discussions about people's attitudes, their uses of smells, and their awareness of it under special circumstances such as rituals, religious experiences, cooking, sociality, and memory. So in a way, smells and smelling have been attended to all along, but they have not necessarily been at the center of analysis and attention. In this paper, I will not go into the details of these numerous works and many possible ways, but I want to focus rather on a short piece by Alfred Gell. Alfred Gell, in the article called Magic, Perfume, Dream, which he wrote in 1977, and this was reprinted in 2006 in the Smell Culture Reader. His essay on scents and smell and perfume stands out with its specific focus on olfactory qualities in general and the effects in ritual in particular. Gell takes up the olfactory element in magical substances. He states that his New Guinean Umeda ethnography allows him to link odoriferousness and magical significance in a correlated way. In numerous contexts, informants explicitly stated that it was the smell of a magical preparation which endowed it with its efficacy. He says ginger-based medicines are prime examples of this. He describes how, in pig-killing magic, the smell of ginger had an effect as a magical perfume, attracting the highly valued wild pigs sought by hunters. Although this is a fairly straightforward efficacy, as explained by Gell, he expands his analysis further and first asks how a perfume acts as an attractant. I quote, "The olfactory domain is one of the least explored aspects of human symbolic experience, but not for that reason one of the least significant. Just how and in what sense does perfume attract?" End of quote. Gell then goes on to link this mechanism of attraction to the dreams of hunters and their magic. I find Gell's analysis highly relevant for contextualizing the neurological and chemical explanations of how smells function and pointing out the ambiguity of the efficacy of smells. And here I have a longish passage from his work, which I will produce here, you could follow. The semiological status of smells is indeed highly ambiguous, for it would seem that we are dealing neither with a system of chemical communication, which could be handled within a purely ethological perspective, nor yet with a sign system, since the smell aspect of the world is so intimately bound up with its purely physical and physiological constitution that it can in no sense be considered conventional. Somewhere in between the stimulus and the sign, a place must be found for the restricted language of smells, traces which, unlike words, only partially detach themselves from the world of objects to which they refer. Now, I will highlight some of the significant parts I find in this paragraph from Gell's observation. That somewhere in between the stimulus and the sign, a place must be found for the restricted language of smells, traces which, he says, unlike words, only partially detach themselves from the world of objects to which they refer. Here we see the fragrance, for example, of a rose, when cognitively transmitted as a restricted language into our brain, only partially detaches itself from the object, from the rose itself. This gap, so to speak, could be and needs to be filled in with various other stimuli, like visual images with colors, shapes, forms, and the like, and it needs to be linguistically defined and addressed. That means we need our other senses as well as language to be able to cognitively comprehend the smell and the smell of a rose. In other words, unlike spoken or written language, the smell only partially detaches itself from the object it refers. Is it a plant? Is it a perfume? Meaning there could be various processes involved in this detachment from the object. In fact, neuroscientists refer to this process as the smell needing to be linked with a visual component like color, or a linguistic component like a concept such as wood, floral, etc., in order to be classified and systematized. Those of you familiar with the description of perfumes would be familiar with these color and linguistic descriptive adjectives. Here I found one picture of the famous Coco Chanel's perfume, and here's the description of it, where you really need to know all these concepts. These are not all self-evident from its linguistic aspects, and they are terms like flowery, spicy, woody, which you really need to make a sort of connection in your cognition to what it means for the smell itself. The questions which would be raised at this point are, how does the smell of a plant, such as a rose, get transferred as a recognizable smell of the rose? And B, how is the smell of rose transformed into a perfume? How does it get translated as the smell of the perfume? Now I will be next looking at rose as a plant. As the next step, I would like to turn to the materiality of the rose plant and rose plantations in Sparta. As indicated at the beginning, roses in Sparta are a special breed, Rosa damascena, which produce fragrant and oil-bearing rose blossoms. It is a hybrid of Rosa gallica and Rosa phoenicia or Rosa moscata. Its flowers blossom once a year in early summer during the months of May and June for about 8 to 10 weeks. Ayten Altuntaş, who is a chemist and a professor of medical and pharmaceutical history, says that the rose plant has existed in Anatolia for nearly 1 million years, and that it was cultivated during the Greek and Roman civilizations in the region, followed up by the Seljuk and Ottoman periods. The rose blossoms have to be picked on the day of blossoming, starting very early in the morning and ideally finished latest by noon. The fragrant rose oil evaporates with every hour of the day and every degree of air warming. Hence, it requires quick, labor-intensive hand picking and fast processing. Planting roses is considered to be relatively easy. They are propagated using cuttings from the existing rose bushes that are placed in the earth in a certain manner, from which the rose bushes grow and can be harvested after about 3 years. Planting roses and tending them is relatively easy, but productivity is dependent on climatic and topographic conditions. If winter has come late, is cold with sudden spells of frost, or if spring rain is insufficient, the harvest may be low and there will be a shortage of roses for the processing firms. This was the case in 2015. In 2016, the winter was exceptionally mild, and hence the roses blossomed earlier than usual. The harvest season started at the beginning of May. In 2018, the harvest had already started by mid-April, ending in late May. As in the harvesting seasons in 2016, 17, and 18, frequent rains during harvesting prolonged the work and increased the length of harvest time. Other than the issues related to the climate, rainfall, and geographic specificities of the landscape, the rose plants must also be protected from diseases and parasites, require some irrigation, and must be fertilized. The methods and balanced timing of tending rose gardens and fields are important and affect the productivity of the gardens, of the plants, and the time of harvesting, and the quality of the essential oil. The quality of essential oil is often cited as being an important factor for determining success in exporting rose oil, especially to well-known and established firms in the perfume industry in the West. But the quality of the essential oil from the rose does not seem to be fully established until the production and distillation. Parfumeurs even claim that the quality of the essential oil can only be established through smelling and not through some chemical process. That is, whether or not the oil is pure and of high quality for use in the perfume industry needs to be tested and evaluated by the perfume making industry. This obviously is another realm of mystification which the rose processors, that is the distillation firms, cannot control, at least not fully, and the procedure is connected to perfume makers' bodily cultivated skills of smelling. This is actually a skill one needs to learn becoming a parfumer. It's a bit similar to the connoisseurs in wine industry. Coming back to the smell of the rose, and before it is processed in distillation firms, I would like to expand a bit on how the smell is experienced by those who grow the plants like rose farmers, and by those who harvested, rose pickers and laborers, and by immediate consumers of rose petals and flowers. During my fieldwork periods in the months of May and June, I engage in conversations with all these groups of actors, meaning farmers and pickers, as well as with those who are involved in its image, control, and branding. City administrators, members of the trade organizations, officers of the agricultural cooperative, shop sellers, common people buying rosewater products and cosmetics, visitors to the city, and rural-urban migrants. Roses are commonly grown by family farms, where the size of workforce is decisive for the size of the rose fields. Rose farmers during the harvesting season may be harvesting by themselves or may additionally employ rose pickers. Hence, they are busy organizing early morning field trips and transporting the sacks full of roses to the buying counters and scale keepers. These scale keepers are usually fellow villagers, and they are employed by the rose oil firms. And the scales are available in most of the villages where there are rose gardens. So the farmer's experience of the materiality of the rose is very much related to the cycle and organizational work. Women farmers almost always take part in harvesting, and they noted that after picking the rose for weeks, every day they would get a headache from the smell, and their hands would become covered with a sticky liquid from the flowers. So did it happen to my hands too. They worried about being stung by bees if they were delayed in harvesting and it became warm, or complained about the cold if they had to start very early at dawn. Immediately after a rainfall, bees may be absent, but then one has to work through the deep mud of the gardens. Here you see the farmers actually with their muddy boots. For farmers, therefore, roses are not so different than other vegetables and fruits they harvest. They appreciate the beauty of it and like the smell, but not much more than that. Rose harvesters, the laborers, as you see on the right side, are recruited by large landowners, usually from the region and from mountain villages, but also, and more recently, from among the Syrian refugees. For these day laborers, their own labor is even more dominant in their perception of the rose. The women I had been accompanying during their labor in the fields were concerned about the amount of hours they worked, the conditions of their payment, whether they got some food from the harvest owner, for instance, the landscape and the number of gardens they needed to cover for the day. The fact that the rose has a nice smell was clearly secondary, if not negligible in their work and attitude. The smell of the rose as something remarkable and valuable came up mostly in conversations with those who were not immediately or recently involved in harvesting and planting the rose. The administrators of the agricultural cooperative, the rose oil firm owners and managers, these were all almost local persons, the academicians at the university, many of whom were also local people, and some were involved in doing some kind of research on the rose and rose oil. They were all enthusiastic about the smell of the rose and the time of harvesting being a special temporal period in the region. The city smells of roses during May and June, I was often told by such persons, although I could not smell it unless I was in the actual vicinity of fields and gardens. Many of the rosewater and rose oil processors nostalgically remembered how, as children, they had been taken to the fields for picking and harvesting roses, and how they all liked this. Again, all these multiple aspects of the materiality and beauty of the rose suggest that there need to be some connections, visual, sensual, and memorial, established between the presence and absence of the rose and its fragrance. Now let's move on to rose oil production. As indicated above, roses, especially the fragrant oil-bearing rose, Rosa damascena, have a restricted blossoming season of about 2 months a year. The fragrance is described as quickly evaporating after harvesting, so the distillation process needs to start immediately after they are picked, and that they are processed as full flower blossoms. They should not be picked before they are fully budding, before they are fully blossoms, and after they have fully blossomed. So it's a very sort of specific time. The urgency of capturing the fragrance requires that the harvest takes place daily, regularly, and swiftly, and that roses get transferred to the distillation firms and places as fast as possible. The rose oil industry is considered to be one of the most important industries in contemporary Sparta. Some 18 firms produce and export rose oil, and some also create other rose products, which are like the ones you see here, like rose water, but also rose concrete and rose absolute. These are the ingredients for cosmetics especially, and for perfume as well. Not only perfume and cosmetics, also aroma industry, food industry, and health industry. For this, production, distillation, and extraction machines and some laboratory equipment are necessary, but on the whole, it is not considered to be a very complicated or sophisticated procedure. The specificity of the production has to do with the immediate link between rose harvest and rose oil production. During the harvest season, roses are picked daily, as I said, and they are brought to the factories as quickly as possible. And then they are, the cauldrons are filled with water and heated for distillation. This marks a crucial difference between the rose and other agricultural produce, in that it cannot be stored at all. After about 3 or 4 hours and several distillation procedures, the raw rose oil and processed rose water can be collected. Here you see at the top this sort of specific slice of the rose oil at the top, and below is the rose water primarily, which also gets processed. Now let us look at the rose oil production in numbers. The ratio of rose oil in the production process of rose to rose oil in the production process is equally crucial. Depending on the quality of the rose, one needs from 2.5 to 3.5 tons of roses to produce 1 liter of rose oil. The productivity of a rose garden, depending on climate, soil, altitude, and other factors, is typically that 3.5 tons from 5 decars. This is about 0.5 hectare of land, meaning that from the harvest of a rose garden of this size, one can extract a minimum of 1 liter rose oil. Nevertheless, rose plantations and gardens covered only about 1% of total cultivable land in Sparta in 2018. Nearly 70% of the agrarian income was from fruit production. So even if little arable land is used for cultivating roses, and tons of roses are needed for 1 liter of rose oil, it is still a profitable industry as rose oil prices are lucrative. Between 2010 and 2016, the price of 1 liter of rose oil in global markets rose from about 5,250 to 11,000 euros, whereas the price of 1 kilo of rose flowers had risen from 0.95 to 2.26 euros. This would mean that a farming family with some 50 decars of land under rose cultivation could get nearly 7,900 euros from the sale of roses. This is in 2016. And if they were to have 3.5 tons of harvest, from which, of course, the labor and other costs would have to be deducted. The rose oil firm, again in 2016, however, would make a profit after subtracting payments to the farmers for the roses, of approximately 3,000 euros per 1 liter oil, from which costs of production, transport, and marketing, of course, would need to be deducted. This is just to give an idea about the profitability of rose and rose oil production. But the sale of rose oil is strongly dependent on global marketing strategies and demand. Hence, the conditions also fluctuate even if the rose processors often claim that Turkey, and actually Sparta as the main leading region, supply 70% of world market demand. This is a sort of one of the myths about the amount. Now, I have moved away from the olfactory aspects of the rose to its economic profitability and significance. Its economic significance has been well articulated in regional policies and agricultural cycles of expanding and retracting the area under cultivation. But how can we incorporate the olfactory aspect and the insights from the anthropology of smell into the political economy of the rose oil? If the smell of the rose is volatile and absent for most of the time during the year, the smell of rose oil is even more ambivalent. Pure and rose oil has been traditionally valued as the perfume of pious Muslims. But this reputation is exactly the reason for its dismissal and rejection by so-called modern and young consumers. It is often referred to as Hacı yağı, which means Hajj oil in Turkish, associating it with Hajjis, the pilgrims, doing their yearly pilgrimage to Mecca. One of the young owners of a rose oil firm said he had been ridiculed by his teacher at school for being the son of an owner of a firm that produces this crudely smelling rose oil. He confessed that he does not like the smell. It's not this guy here on the picture. He's only selling the local products, what you see here. The essential rose oil needs to be refined, chemically processed and combined with other ingredients by perfume makers, not only because it is so costly, but also to improve its quality and appeal. Another young rose oil producer who also produces fragrance and cosmetics, she's quite successful, explains her products as having been refined by French perfume experts, for instance. Therefore, one can identify two processes of decoupling within the transformation of the smell and the rose to a perfume using rose oil. The first is that the olfactory aspect, the perfume production, is decoupled from the rose and rose oil production processes, and therefore the gap between the smell and the plant is vast and gets filled in other geographies and global spaces. This would be obviously a spatial way of thinking for following the transformation process. The second is the decoupling through the refinement of the rose oil for processing it into a perfume ingredient. The geographical decoupling works primarily for the expensive rose oil, but other rose products are used within the same locality of Sparta, where there is some commodity production by local firms, as we have seen in the pictures, on a smaller and cheaper scale, producing the cheap cosmetics and food products I listed at the beginning. With these products as well, the olfactory quality of the fragrant rose needs to be visualized, branded, and marketed in order for the smell to be visible. The rose oil, which gets primarily exported to the perfume and essential oil industry in the West, and also more recently to China, is too expensive to be available as a consumer good in Sparta and does not seem to be a part of the local sensory memory, unlike rose water, which is cheaper, available, and culturally valued. The gap I mentioned at the beginning, relying on the work of gel, seems to be fundamental in all essential oil products. They need to be reconnected to images of the plant. The rose, omnipresent on product packages with colors and depictions, not always true to Rosa Damascena, and the smell needs to be linguistically classified as a sweet, rosy, and refreshing scent, as in many of the rosewater products. Furthermore, the image needs to be and has been largely recontextualized into the cultural history of Turkey and Ottoman Empire, of rosewater as a medical and religiously valued product used by Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad coming in as an alleged consumer of rose oil because it's a non-alcoholic, natural, and fragrant essential oil, even if this is also the reason for dismissing it by other consumers, as we have seen. Hence, there is a range of historical and cultural evocations of the product as being significant, valuable, and beautiful. Now to summarize. What is then involved in the translation of transformation of the smell of rose? As we said, one remarkable physical quality is its elusiveness and evasiveness. The smell is present only for a restricted period of time. That is, the temporality is important. It needs to be captured within this time. We also need to think about the role of cultural learning and cognitive memory. It needs to be cognitively registered and learned, also with the help of language and specific terms. And we also need to think about, assess the role of regional branding and marketing. So economic and cultural institutions and actors shape this process. The regional economy follows the branding strategies and wants to connect the rose cultivation and harvesting season to local and international touristic activities. Here they take their main rival, the Bulgarian rose region around Kazanlak, some of you may know, as a model. Sparta's municipal and provincial authorities have taken the initiative in organizing rose festivals and rose tourism, similar to those in Bulgaria. Here you see a picture from one of the rose festivals in one of the small localities there. During these festivals, some small and medium-sized firms and producers display their products and seek customers with limited success, as far as I can observe. There are also other related cultural and scientific activities, conferences, fairs, concerts, events, etc. All of these activities are again linked to regional economic development plans and projects, summarized as creating, quote unquote, Turkey's Perfume Valley, similar to what has been actually a place, a locality in France around Grasse, the city of Grasse. On the part of users, we need to think about the role of consumption and imaginaries about the good life and about pious and culturally embedded lives. Rosa Damascena is often compared to other regional economies where women have been dominant, such as the handmade rug economy in Sparta, which had a boom in the 1970s until the 1970s and disappeared altogether with the emergence of machine-made rugs. Locals often remember this economy and warn against the abuse and overproduction of Rosa Damascena, which might cause the global prices to crash and farmers to give up rose cultivation. In the transformation of the rose into a perfume, so far, as I said at the beginning, I had been looking at the more economic aspects and looking at the actors in it and the price mechanisms, but had paid less attention to the specificity of this volatile product. So some concluding thoughts here. Even if the rose is a local product, its processed products are also and primarily globally consumed. Secondly, the smell needs to be imagined and perceived locally, but this is even more important globally. This is largely done through marketing, but it remains a difficult and unpredictable market. Marketing difficulties are primarily explained in terms of smell being an individually acquired and cultivated sense, whereas fragrance in the form of perfumes needs to be marketed for mass consumption. Hence, smelling, unlike seeing and hearing, is less standardized and involves complex processes and hidden, non-explicit dimensions of translation. Now I have here final slide, a brochure of a company for synthetic odors. And this is about final note about replacing Rosa Damascena synthetically, because many of the firms try synthetic odors, and numerous odors are synthetically produced, but rose fragrance is apparently difficult to synthesize, according to the firms and the industry. So that seems to be the strength of Rosa Damascena. Thank you.